Hello there and welcome back. Now we're going to move on to our next compositing fundamental, and that is levels. And the main goal of levels is to make sure that your elements feel like they sit within your shot based on their color. And there are two main areas of levels that you need to get right to have a realistic shot, and that's the luminance and the color balance of your elements. So let's hop into Nuke and look at some good and bad examples. We'll start off with what I believe is the correct levels for this shot. This is mostly an entirely CG space shuttle with a photographic background. Everything feels nice and balanced together. There's nothing really jumping out as being overly bright or overly saturated to me. I think this is all sitting pretty well together. This has good luminance and it has good color balance. Let's look into what this would look like if our highlights were bad. All right, so as you can see here, our luminance is very off. The highlights are way too bright. They were nuclear. So look into fixing this here. I'll just add a grade beneath my grade that's breaking this. Again, it's not important exactly how I'm doing it now. I just want to show you how I would adjust it quickly. So we're going to darken this. All right, this feels like it's more in the correct realm. And then once we fix our white levels, then suddenly our black levels are way too dark. This is another luminance problem. So we'll take our lift here and we'll just start tinkering with this until these feel 1-to-1. There we go. This feels pretty close. And our black levels were even a little off before. So now this feels much more balanced. And once again, it's sitting nicely in our scene. So now let's move on to where just the black levels are off. Take a look at our example here. And you can see if we zoom in a little bit that it's lifted down there. And there's no reason for the underside of this ship to be any lighter than that shadow underneath it. So that's something we're going to have to fix. All right, so let's make a grade here. And I'll quickly just adjust the lift so our shadows and the underside of the ship balance out. And all right, there we go. Looking pretty good. Our black levels now match. Black levels can also be off in the opposite direction. They can also be too dark. That's no problem because now we just need to make our blacks a little bit brighter for this to sit. Let's bring that up. All right, these are pretty uniform again. It's sitting very nicely in our scene. Let's look at some improper contrast here. All right, so this shot is interesting because looking at this, our black levels are pretty close. And so are our white levels. Like, this isn't too far off. Maybe it's a little dark, but it doesn't feel like it has any range to the image. And that's because the mid-tone contrast really just isn't there. If I compare it to what we think is the correct levels here, you can see how much better this looks. It has a lot of depth and dynamic range. And so again, we'll just take this quickly. And if your midtones are wrong, typically it's going to be kind of difficult to fix. I'm actually going to just add some contrast in here. Don't want to add too much though. And then I'll probably have to fix the black levels a little. I'll use this offset here. All right, that's pretty close. We've added more range back into our image here. And now it feels like it sits much better. And another thing with contrast is your contrast can actually tell you where exactly your element is sitting in your scene. If this space shuttle were way in the distance, I would probably want this decontrasted look because decontrast implies that there's haze and what you're looking at is very large. If you look at these mountains in the background, they're actually the exact same color as this right here. This is in the photograph, but there's a thin layer of haze that's over them, and that's telling us, hey, there's a large amount of distance between these two. So contrast is not only helpful for sitting in your scene correctly, but it's also telling you where in your scene your object is sitting. I would say these three right here, they make up what is the first part of the levels fundamental. It makes up the luminance portion of it. Is everything balanced in the sense of brightness and contrast? Now to move on and look at our second half, we're going to talk about color balance. Color balance also has two distinct parts to it. It has saturation and it has color tone. So let's take a look at saturation first. Saturation, wow, that is psychedelic. It's very important for everything in your scene to share a similar intensity of your colors. Your colors not only need to be the same, but they also need to be the same intensity. And this is just way too saturated. This is straight out of the 70s. So you can just add a color correct here. Take our saturation down pretty significantly. There we go. And now we're back into the realm of reality. Cool. And that's overall saturation. Everything here was uniformly too saturated and colorful. If you compare the blue of the ground to the blue of the space shuttle is just hyper blue and hyper green compared to it. If you look at the highlights of the space shuttle here, this is so much warmer than this already kind of reddish rock, and that doesn't really make any sense. And so this is an overall saturation correction. But there can also be instances where it's only specific parts that are too bright, because this blue right here is looking pretty good to me. It matches the ground fairly well, but right here, our highlight is still super orange. And you can see even here on the sides, this looks very strange. So it looks like the warm parts are really what's bothering me. So we can use a hue correct. We'll go over how to use this in detail later. Right now, it's just the principle. And we'll kind of selectively bring our warm spots down until they fit within our scene a little nicer. That's a lot better. Maybe we can go even further. Cool. All right. So those two make up the saturation category. There's overall saturation and then specific saturation, and it's important to have them both balanced to your scene. Next, we have color tone, which is the overall color shift of the element you're adding into your shot. So we have overall color tone here. So this is crazy green. We do not need that. Let's just shift this here. So let's just go ahead and take our color wheel here and add a little purple to neutralize that green. Yeah, that was pretty close just right off the gate. We'll take this potentially a little further. There we go. Our color tone is back, and this is sitting nicely in our shot again. We'll just save real quick so I don't lose my progress. All right, let's look here. So this color tone is more isolated. It's more in the dark parts. I don't really see anything wrong with our whites here. And so in that instance, we can go into our lift here. And we will be very delicate in changing this. We'll just slowly take that blue out. There we go. That's sitting much more nicely now. And inversely, you can also have highlights that have bad color tone. This is pretty nasty right here. So we'll just isolate our highlights here in the highlight section of Color Correct. We'll go over this in next week's lesson. Let's see what we can do here to neutralize this. It also looks like our highlights, maybe we can just desaturate this a little. We're adding a lot more green than I would like. What would happen if we just took all the color out? Made this a little more purple. Brighten it. It's still a little green. Let's pump up our saturation here. That's not too bad. I don't think it's perfect. When you start isolating highlights and midtones, it can get pretty tricky. Shadows are pretty easy to isolate, so that's just something to keep in mind. So those are the overall adjustments you'll typically be making to your image using levels. You'll be looking at the luminance of it. You'll be checking the black point, the white point, and the midtone contrast. And you'll be looking at your overall color balance based on your saturation and your color tone. One last thing I want to show you before we move on is explain the difference visually between lift, gamma, and gain. These are very important concepts to understand, and they can be kind of abstract. So I'm going to do my best to show you exactly what the differences are. So let's look at this using a grade node. Pipe that in right here. So lift is our blacks, gamma is our midtones, and gain is our bright points. So let's start by adjusting our blacks or our lift. We'll just change this, and you'll see our blacks are moving the most in this. Our pivot point is actually our brightest point here, and that's not moving at all. But you can see as we crush this image or lift it, we're pivoting around our highlights, which means we're really not affecting them. It's just our blacks that are getting affected. So inversely, let's look at our gain, start bringing this down. This is the exact opposite. We're not touching our blacks, but we are touching our highlights. The blacks are our pivot point here. Gain is interchangeable with multiply, and I'll prove it to you right now. It does the exact same thing. Why these are two separate options, I have no idea. Now gamma affects our midtones. You'll see something interesting as we start to affect this. Neither our brightest brights or our darkest darks move, but we're changing our midtones. Something you have to keep in mind that this curve doesn't entirely show, but we're also moving anything that's brighter than 1. And so if we're taking our gamma down, anything that's brighter than the value of 1 is actually getting brighter as we're seemingly darkening the image. And inversely, as we're lifting our gamma, we're actually darkening anything that's brighter than 1. You have to visualize this curve continuing and flattening out compared to our original linear curve. Increasing the gamma is commonly used for decontrasting, where decreasing it increases the contrast. And you can see why because of this curve here. The other option we have left in here is our offset, and that just uniformly adds values or subtracts values to our image here. And how do black points relate to lift? Because our black point is trying to normalize the darkest part of our image to 0. So if we were to say our black point is at 0.1, it snaps down. Right here is the value of 0.1, and it's bringing it down to 0. If we were to say our black point is negative 0.1, negative 0.1 we can imagine is over here. Remember, this curve goes beyond what we can see here, and it has snapped to 0. So black point and lift move in the opposite directions. If I were to take lift in negative 1, they cancel out. And this is the same as if nothing happened. This right now is the equivalent of having our black point at 0.2 with our lift at 0. So it's important to note that black point and lift, if you have the exact same values in them, they will cancel each other out. The same goes for white point and gain. Let's just look at that really quick. We're saying here, we want 0.9 to actually be 1, and you can see it snap there. But then, again, if you take our gain down, it snaps back. It's good to keep in mind how all of these things work under the hood in case you want to take advantage of them later. You can use your white point and gain to automate interactive lighting, say fire, for example, or lens flare. There's a lot you can do with these tools if you understand how they work. And that concludes our in-depth look at levels. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.